Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm so glad to see you all in good health. I am very sure that all of you are very much interested in finding out what's going on in the world's second largest economy, which happened to be the largest trading partner for Korea, and that is Chinese economy. This morning we are very, very fortunate to have special speaker. In fact, he just flew in from Hong Kong to meet with us this morning. He will enlighten us everything about China most authoritative way. Professor Lau is currently is the Ralph and Claire Landau Professor of Economics at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. But before that, of course, he spent most of his academic career teaching and research at Stanford University. He joined faculty of Stanford University in 1966, and then he spent most of his academic career there until 2006. I said he will tell us about Chinese economy most authoritative way. In fact, he was the first person who built econometric model for Chinese economy as early as 1966, I gather. He has been one of the leading economists in the field of development and economic growth and East Asia, Asian economies, particularly China. I'm sure many of you who studied in the United States, particularly if you took development courses, you must have run into so many of his books and articles. He contributes so much in that field. He moved to Hong Kong, and then he served as the vice chancellor of the university, which was president of the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And recently, I know that he is engaged in consultative capacity for the Chinese economy. He was a member of the 11th and 12th National Committee of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference and vice chairman of a subcommittee of economics. And then he serves on various research institutes and advisory capacity. So he knows current Chinese government policy directions as a policy advisor and as economist and analyst. So I said he will tell us all about Chinese economy in most authoritative way. Well, again, as I said, he just flew in this morning to meet with us. I appreciate very much for taking time. In fact, he will be attending trilateral commission meeting, which will begin this evening and tomorrow I'll be with him for that meeting as well. Well, with no further ado, I'd like to invite Professor Landau. Please join me in welcoming.
Thank you very much, Chairman Sakong, and great pleasure and great honor to be here today. Chairman and I have been friends for longer than I can remember. So it's really a pleasure to be here. I will be posting this presentation, this PowerPoint, on my web pages in a couple of days, okay, after I return to Hong Kong. So feel free to download. Well, as we all know, that China has made tremendous progress in its economic development since it began its reform and opened to the world in 1978. China has averaged a growth rate of about almost 10% over the last 37 years, and it is really historically unprecedented for the economy to grow so fast and over such a long period of time. The Chinese GDP today is around 10.4 trillion US dollars in 2014 prices, compared to 17.4 for the United States. The IMF actually claimed that if you look at purchasing power parity, that the Chinese economy is now a little bit higher, bigger than the U.S. economy. But I'm a skeptic about purchasing power parity measurements. So, they are very sensitive to the set of prices you pick. I would not put too much faith in the IMF estimates. This chart shows you a little bit of what happened. This is U.S. and Chinese GDP. You could the blue line is the U.S. GDP. The red line is the Chinese GDP. The columns are the annual growth rates. Okay, so you can see very clearly from this picture that until 1978 or thereabouts, the Chinese economy hardly grew. You know what I mean? So sticking to the bottom, to the horizontal axis. But after reform, it began to take off. And actually, if you really look at the data, after 2000, when China acceded to the WTO, the economy really began to grow very rapidly. And you could see there's still a gap. Okay, I mean, the U.S. economy is still about 70% higher, larger than the Chinese economy today. This chart shows, but in terms of per capita terms, this is per capita GDP. In terms of per capita terms, China is still way behind. Chinese GDP per capita is now probably 7,600 US dollars compared to something like 55,000 for the U.S. So it would take a long time. You can just tell visually. And as you can see, this is despite the fact that China has been growing much faster than the U.S. in per capita GDP and also in GDP. When you start with a very low base, it takes a long, long time to catch up. I think that's something that you should take into account. Now, this next chart shows trade. What's happening to international trade? As the chairman mentioned, China is now Korea's #1 trading partner. It is actually #1 trading partner for many countries now. Okay, I think including, the United States. It's the #1 trading partner for the United States. But you can see it's actually all quite recent. Okay, especially you can tell that it's after 2008. After year 2000, after entry in WTO, that you can see the trade really went up. I mean, there's a little bit of a drop here, and that's because of the global economic crisis. But you can see that the gap is closing. That is the total value of trade in goods and services. China is actually catching up quite rapidly with the U.S. I think China might be the largest in terms of trade in goods today, but the U.S. is much bigger in trade in services. So combined, the U.S. still has an edge. This chart is very interesting. Look at the year 2013, and I hope you can read it back at the back. But basically, this is the China's rank on the second column as a trading partner for the country and region. You can see that it is really #1 and #2 for most of the East Asian countries. And then on the other side are the ranks of various countries as a trading partner of China. All right. So for Japan, for Korea, China is the largest trading partner. For United States, actually number 2. I think Canada is still the number 1. Canada being close enough to the U.S. Okay, now let us now look a little bit into the economic fundamentals. What has been driving Chinese economic growth? I think the most important thing is actually the saving rate. You can see here, I have plotted a savings rate from around 1952 to the present, and you can see it's really quite high. This is about 40%. The red line is the savings rate, and the blue line is the investment rate. Okay, and the two go more or less together until you get here around 2005 or so, when that there is a gap, but the gap is also closing. The gap between savings and investment, as we know, is really the trade surplus. Okay, Chinese trade surplus has really been coming down as a percent of GDP, and this is really what is happening. But what are the advantages of having a high savings rate? The advantages of having a high savings rate is that you can invest a lot, right, without really relying on foreign capital. You don't need foreign loans, you don't need foreign aid, you don't need foreign investment. You can actually build up your capital very rapidly. You can contrast this. In fact, I think most East Asian economies have high savings rate. You can contrast this with Latin American countries where they really have a low savings rate. And Latin American countries, Brazil, Argentina, I mean, they would do well for a decade or so, you know, maybe, on the basis of capital inflows. But then when the foreign investors would like to repatriate their earnings, there will be a currency crisis, and that it will actually, for the next 5-10 years, it will go into a recession. So I think this is a huge advantage for not for China, of course, but also for East Asian economies by having basically a very high domestic saving rate. Okay. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is the labor. I think that most East Asian countries, beginning with Japan, Taiwan, Korea, they all went through a stage in which they had a great deal of surplus labor from agriculture. Okay, so this is what I want to show you. Here, the green part is the GDP originating from agriculture. Green is agriculture, primary sector. The blue part is the GDP originating from manufacturing, mining, and construction. Okay, the secondary sector. And the red part here is the services, the tertiary sector. You can see that the contribution from agriculture started at 50% of GDP, is now down to just below 10% of GDP. Okay, I mean, huge change over a period of 50, 60 years. The manufacturing, mining, and construction is now about 42%. All right, and then, but tertiary sector, service sector is now the largest. It is now about 48% of Chinese GDP. Okay, and it's actually, for the last year or so, the service sector has actually been growing faster than the manufacturing, mining, and construction sector. But then look at the next chart. The next chart actually has to do with employment. And you could see that back in 1952, more than 80% of the labor force was employed in agriculture, 80%. Okay, it's really gone down quite a bit. If you follow the green line. It's now around, I would say, around a little bit 40%. Okay, but still very high. The manufacturing is now basically employing maybe about 30% of the labor force, a little bit above 30, and the tertiary sector employing maybe about 38% or so forth. So anyway, so that is about the distribution. But what I want to bring to your notice is the following, and that is the agricultural sector generates only about 10%, less than 10% of GDP, but it employs close to 40% of labor force. Okay, what does that tell you? That tells you that there is still a great deal of room for moving the labor from agriculture into the secondary sector, tertiary sector. Okay, and that actually means that there's still the demographics. I'll talk about a little later. Still favors a relatively high rate of growth. It hasn't really run out of surplus labor as yet. Okay. Okay. The next thing I like to point out is really the unimportance of exports of goods and services. This is just relative. What I have plotted down here are the shares of exports of goods and services as a percent of GDP, selected economies. And China is here, okay, and Korea is here. You can see Korea actually has a higher export dependence than China. Some countries are very high. This is Hong Kong, huge dependence. Trade is, as a percent of GDP, is over 100%. This is Singapore, also very, very high. Thailand, Vietnam, Taiwan, and so forth. But China is very low. Japan is even lower. And the U.S. is also very low. Okay. So what does that tell us? That basically says that as a large economy, the larger economy is really not too much dependent on what happens outside. Okay, it's really the smaller economies small open economies that become vulnerable to external disturbances. Okay, and the same is true if you look at imports, same idea, okay, so, and then, okay, let me see, okay. So anyway, so what I really want to say here is that the exports were very important to China at the initial phase of development, but now it can no longer be a very powerful driving force for Chinese growth going forward. It would be mostly due to internal demand, okay, and which is the case for the United States. And so I think that is really the way to think about it, is that we shouldn't expect export surpluses, large export surpluses anymore. We really also cannot expect large, very high rates of growth for exports as a whole. For China. Now, what are some of the sources of Chinese economic growth? If you look back, I think there are several factors. The first one is what I just talked about, is that you have very high rates of growth of capital, and you also have very high rates of growth of labor, okay? And especially by the movement of labor from the agricultural sector to the secondary and tertiary sectors. But second thing is really quite important, is that remember, China before 1978 was a centrally planned economy, and centrally planned economies, they have actually built-in slacks. I don't have time to talk about this, but basically, most centrally planned economies do not operate right on the frontier of their production possibilities. All right, so that really means that once you give these producers autonomy, once you give them some incentives, the output can increase drastically. But even without increasing inputs, by just simply moving to the production possibilities. So that's the second part, is using up the latent potential. Okay, but a third thing is actually quite important, and that is the effects of economies of scale. China is a very large economy, and one advantage of a large economy is that you have all sorts of economies of scale. Okay, at the plant level, you can build any plant, an automobile plant. You can build one with, 250,000 vehicles a year. For a small economy, they would need to require an export. But for China, the internal market is so huge. Okay, so that you can easily accommodate very large-scale, efficient plants in almost every manufacturing industry. There are other economies of coordination that really can happen in a very large economy. But let me show you here what the advantages of a large economy can be. This shows you here we're showing you the quarterly rates of growth of exports of goods, selected Asian economies. And you can see that, everybody fluctuates. The red line is China, and I think Korea is the turquoise line. Okay, you can probably see it. But anyway, everybody's exports fluctuates. Okay, I mean, just the world economy ebbs and flows and so forth. Similarly, you have imports. They also fluctuate. All right, you can see all the points. 2008, you can see 1997. You can see all the peaks and the troughs. But if you look at GDP, see, this is the most worthwhile chart to look at. Look at the red line. The red line also goes up and down, but is relatively stable, compared to the other economies where the quarterly rates of growth will actually go negative, some very negative, right? And I think that actually is really one demonstration that for a very large economy, whatever happens outside would have an impact, but it will not have a huge impact. Okay. Now, I don't want to bore you with details, but basically, what do we know about economies of scale? Well, nobody really knows what it really is. There was an economist named Edward Dennison in the US who actually said that it's probably 1.1, the degree of economy of scale. That means if you double all inputs, output would double by 1.1 times, would increase by 1.1 times. There's some recent research that Michael Boskin and I have been doing, and we actually find it as close to 1.1. But anyhow, but don't underestimate the 1.1 relative to 1. I've done some calculations that supposing you have two economies, one small one and large one, they both have inputs growing at 7%. Okay, now for constant return to scale, the small economy will grow at 7% per year. The larger one would grow at 7.7% per year. But even a 0.7% difference per year translates into a huge number. Okay, if you look at 10 years, it would be 2.6 times. Okay, you look at 20 years, it was 6.7 times. It's really the magic, the power of compound interest, even with a small difference, can make a huge difference. So I think that is also one way to look at the growth of China, is that there is economy of scale at work. Now, if you look at other economies in the world, where else would you find economy of scale? I think India. India is really a place where you would expect to find substantial economy of scale if, in fact, India can realize its potential of being a large economy by building in all the infrastructure. So that is something to remember. The next thing I'd like to talk a little bit about is what is called the wild geese flying pattern of development. I think this is probably well known to you. There's a Japanese economist named Akamatsu who actually proposed that the East Asian development, industrial development, is very, very much these flying geese. And then the particular point about flying geese is that there's always a leading goose, which is flying the fastest, but they take turns. So today it would be Japan being the fastest growing. The next day, next period, it could be Taiwan. The next period, it could be Korea. So the flying goose, the head goose, always changes. And I think that is a very good parable to think about East Asian growth. Okay, that is successively different economies will become the fastest growing, and the other economies will come up. It actually explains East Asian industrialization quite well. Okay, as it spread from Japan first to Hong Kong, Taiwan, Korea, and then to Southeast Asia, and then to China. But I think the thing to think about is that also can apply to China itself. Okay, because in China, what happens is that the provinces on the coast, Guangdong, for example, and Shanghai, they grew first, right? And then you have other provinces on the coast, and now they have actually slowed down. I mean, many Korean businessmen do business in China, you know that has slowed down on the coast. But the new growth actually comes from inland. Okay, the inland provinces are now the fastest growing. So that's really the way to think of how China can actually continue growing. And this is really one way, is that as the coastal areas slow down, the inland provinces will begin to grow very quickly. For example, I understand that Samsung has invested more than $20 billion in a semiconductor manufacturing facilities near Xi'an, and that is really very much internal in one of the interior provinces. Now, the next thing I'd like to talk a little bit about is China as a surplus economy. Okay, this may come as a surprise to you, because while everybody knows that there's surplus labor in China, I'm going to tell you that now there's surplus capital. Okay, so a surplus economy. China has been growing really very fast. It has a very high domestic savings rate, and therefore it also has a very high domestic investment rate. But what has really happened in the last 5-10 years, in the last decade, is a tremendous build-up in manufacturing capacity. Okay, I think everybody knows that there's excess capacity almost in every major manufacturing industry. In steel, in cement, in glass, in shipbuilding, solar panels, aluminum, you name it. And I think very soon we might see some excess capacity in the automobile manufacturing. So this is a real thing. And that's really why I start to talk about surplus capital economy, because there's too much surplus capacity. So that's one. Secondly, and for those of you who have visited China recently, if you go to the second, third, fourth tier cities, you'll find that there's overbuilt residential housing. Okay, lots of housing that are empty, that stay empty. Anyway, the average capacity utilization rate in many manufacturing industries is now around 70%, okay, which is very low. It's very hard to make money if you have 70% utilization rate. But so you can think of this investment as being basically excessive investment, which is basically wasted, which is true. But then there's a positive side. There's a silver lining to the excess capacity, and that is the following. Chinese real GDP is now not supply constrained, but aggregate demand determined, because there's plenty of supply, more supply than you can use. So if you actually have some demand, supply will be forthcoming. All right, so that is really the way to think about the Chinese economy today, that it is no longer supply constrained. 20 years ago, definitely supply constrained, right? But now it is actually aggregate demand determined. So if the government can come up with the aggregate demand, the economy will actually continue to grow, all right? So there's there's no constraint. The other thing to think about is that the social cost actually would be quite low, since you have so much excess capacity. So producing more, let's say the government increases its aggregate demand, really the social cost is very low, because you have the capacity, the facility have been built, and then there are workers you have to support, and so forth. But the important thing to realize here is that the growth of exports and fixed investment in manufacturing and residential housing can no longer be the principal drivers of the growth of Chinese aggregate demand going forward. I think that's an important thing. Now, how did this surplus economy come about? It came about because massively excess fixed investment. I don't really have time to go into a great detail, but most of this come at the local level. Okay, I mean the local officials, they are under pressure to increase GDP and employment, and then they discover they don't have much of revenue, but they have land. And so if they could change the zoning on the land use, they can create a great deal of wealth, and with that resources, it could construct steel plants, cement plants, and so forth. So that is really one of the causes of the excessive investment. Okay. Now, I don't have time to go into this, but basically in China, there's actually a excessive demand for credit that's chronic, and that is really why interest rate has remained very high. Okay, I mean, for those of you in business, you know that bank interest rate is not so high, but you can't get it, right? So by the time you get it through trust companies or other places, the rate can be very high. Now, why is the rate that high? And if you think about it, since the Chinese yuan has been appreciating with respect to US dollar, you expect the interest rate parity theory says that the Chinese interest rate should be lower than the US interest rate, right? Just to compensate for the fact that it is appreciating. But it's not the case, okay? It's not the case. If you look at the interest rate differential between China and the US, you can see that the Chinese rate, the red line, is most of the time much higher than the blue line, okay? And that really tells you something. And I think that really means that in China, there are borrowers who really are not deterred by interest rates. And fundamentally, I think many borrowers think that if things turn sour, they don't have to repay, right? And when you have that attitude, you would always want to borrow more if you don't plan to repay. And I think that's one of the problems why you have this excessive investment. But anyhow, what are some of the sources of future growth, since you can't have exports are not likely to grow very fast, and investment in manufacturing and residential housing would not work very well. I think we go back to several things. One is public infrastructure investment, high-speed railroads, but the only thing, the high-speed railroad network actually is almost complete. It's almost complete. But urban mass transit systems, there's a great deal of room for doing that. Chinese cities of over 2 million population, probably somewhere between 70 to 100, and you can build mass transit systems. They don't have to be subways, they could be light rails and so forth. The key really is to enable people to live to live well without actually having to drive a car, right? I mean, one of the things is that if everyone in China has a car in every garage, the world would be in trouble. China would be in trouble. All right. So that's one thing. Wi-Fi towers, you could build it so they have more access, provide more access to the internet in urban areas, affordable housing. Also, I mean, water shortage is a real problem in China. One could build seawater desalination plants, national strategic petroleum reserve to build facilities. So there are lots of things that can still be done, okay, that will make use of the excess manufacturing capacity. Public goods consumption. For example, China, both the Chinese government and the Chinese public have become very environmentally conscious, right? And I think they would really make an effort to clean up the air, the water, the soil, and all of that will take resources, will take investments. Okay, I think that can eat up, they can use up a lot of investment. Education, healthcare, elderly care are also very much needed services. So public goods, provision of public goods can also take become a large component of aggregate demand. I think urbanization provides a unifying theme for expanding public infrastructure projects and public goods consumption. If you really want to promote public goods, they are actually much best in the urban context. It's very hard to promote public goods in the rural context. Many of the services actually are better provided in the urban areas. Now, a lot of people talk about household consumption in China, all right? In fact, how consumption as measured by retail sales, by real retail sales, have been growing at 150% of GDP growth, okay, which is very healthy. That means, you know, GDP grows at 7%, real consumption, household consumption will grow at 10.5%, okay? But be that as it may, it is still not fast enough, right, to become a major driver of economic growth. The disposable household income as a share of Chinese GDP is around 43.2%, all right, most recent data. Less than half. So even if people don't save anything, consumption would be at most 43.2% of GDP, okay? That's much, much lower than in the United States and in other developed economies. I'm sure it's much lower than Korea. Okay, so now the other thing is that what is the household savings rate as distinct from the national savings rate? Household savings rate in China out of the disposable income can be estimated around 30%. Okay, and that really means that the consumption, household consumption as a percent of GDP is around 30% of GDP. Okay, so but 30% household savings rate is actually very comparable to the household savings rate that we observe at ethnically Chinese households in Hong Kong and Taiwan. They are actually very comparable. So it's not excessively high, it's not excessively low. They are basically quite, quite comparable. Okay, but that really tells you the following, is that unless household income is dramatically increased, okay, household consumption cannot be very large percentage GDP, no matter what you do. All right, so I think that is the lesson. I think that ought to be a goal to increase household income, to increase household consumption, but it's not going to happen overnight. It will take a long time to increase, basically to increase labor share of the economy. Now, what I've put down here are the monthly rates of growth for Chinese retail sales, and you can see that it's actually come down during the for a little while, but it's now basically have stabilized, and it is really at around a little bit above 10%, 10.5%, 11%, which is consistent with what I said earlier, that is really about 1.5 times, 150% of the rates of growth of real GDP. I think that's likely to continue. There's a rising middle class and so forth. It's likely to continue, but even at this rate, consumption cannot rise very fast without a significant increase in income. Okay. Now, all right. Now, the thing about public infrastructure investment and public goods consumption is that in order to promote these things, you require leadership and support of both the central government and the local government. Okay, you cannot, the private sector cannot do public infrastructure investment. Private sector cannot really do public goods. Private sector can be the contractor. If you want to clean up the pollution, you can hire one or more private firms to do the work. But fundamentally, the resources have to come from the public, from the public sector. So that's actually one important thing. And the other thing is that as you do these things, you clean the environment and so forth, one of the things you face is that a great deal of the benefits are not included in the GDP. Okay, the air, whether the air is cleaner or is PM 2.5 has a 50 rating or a 400 rating, it's not reflected in GDP. Okay, so the cleaning up would make everyone would welcome it, but it will not reflect in GDP. So you might find a lower measured rate of growth of GDP as you shift your expenditures into these areas. I'm for it. But I'm just saying that you have to, unless you measure GDP in some different way, you're going to see GDP growth rate come down. But the other thing that I I think is very good about public goods consumption is that it is actually a redistribution in kind. All right, because whether you are rich or poor, you breathe the same air. So if you actually can improve the environment, you can provide the public goods. It is really a form of redistribution. So you can actually redistribute in kind without actually having to redistribute in monetary terms. Okay, which is actually even better because something like environmental control and so forth, it really has to be done collectively. If you give the money back to the households, they can't do it. Households cannot help you clean up the environment. Only a collective action by the government, by local government, can clean up the environment. Okay. Now, I want to say a couple words about the importance of expectations. Economists all believe in expectations. Expectations actually drive the economy. I want to give you 3 examples why, if you can change expectations, it can be very powerful very powerful economic effects. In 1992, I don't know how many of you remember, Mr. Deng Xiaoping undertook his very famous Southern tour in the first quarter of 1992, and that actually sent a signal to the entire country that now is the time to invest, now is the time to consume. And 1992, the rest of 92, 93, 94 were boom years. Really, growth rates were above double-digit rates. But if you look at it before 1992, Chinese economy was very much in recession, not doing very well. And that tells you the power of changing expectation. If you can change the expectation, that is really very powerful. Second thing is in 1997, we had the East Asian currency crises. I think Korea was really suffering. Many other economies in the East Asia, Indonesia, Thailand, they were all suffering. China faced with a decision whether to devalue along with everybody else or whether to hold the currency rate. Okay, and China, I think, very wisely and correctly decided to just hold the currency and not devalue. But that also sent a very strong signal that this is what's going to happen, and I think that the economy was able to hold despite the crisis. And the same happened in 2008. 2008, I think it was actually quite scary. I'm sure Korean economy had the same experience. That is, right after Lehman Brothers collapsed in September 2008. The banks in the U.S. completely froze. They couldn't do anything. And I think all the exporters in Asia, all of a sudden, they were receiving no orders, right? Because no bank can issue, American bank can issue letter of credit, and all of a sudden, orders dry up, all right? In China, export orders dropped about 50% overnight. 50%. I mean, okay, so what is there to do? And I think the Wen Jiabao, the premier, then basically push out within 6 weeks, push out a 4 trillion yuan stimulus program. It actually would take another year before the program could be implemented. But just pushing that out at that time changed expectations, okay? Because people thought that, okay, things are going to be all right. We will continue investing, we will continue consuming. And that's very important. So I think that is something that economists don't pay enough attention, because it's not so much the expectation based on the past. It's really expectations about the future and how you can change people's expectation about the future that would change things. For example, if you look at Japan, I think Japan has been in recession for the last 20 years, right? And why? Because I think people were convinced that things are not going to get better. And if you think things are not going to get better, or going to get worse, you're not going to invest, you're not going to consume. And in fact, that's self-fulfilling. If people, enterprises don't invest, households don't consume, and because you expect things are going to be bad, it will be bad, right? Because these expectations can be self-fulfilling. So you need something to change expectations, right? And it takes a long time. I think in the U.S. they have succeeded. I think the U.S. government through the QEs has succeeded in saving the financial institutions, saving the U.S. from financial collapse. But it really has not changed expectations that much. Okay, I think people are still really quite pessimistic. If you look at, say, household savings rate in the U.S., in the best of times, household savings rate would be negative. You look at the data. But now it's actually positive 5%, 6%. People are sort of worried that why aren't people consuming more, right? Because that economy, the U.S. economy, actually relies very heavily on people going out and consuming. So I think expectations is actually very important, and I think that going forward for China, that the keeping up the expectation, keeping people's confidence is important. I'm actually quite optimistic that 7% growth going forward is doable based on the fundamentals, but you need to work on the expectations. Ongoing economic challenges, there are many. Let me just go through them very quickly. Aging population, okay? And as you know, every economy, the population is aging, but China is aging especially fast because it had a one-child policy since, basically since 1980, okay, or thereabouts. If you really continue the one-child policy indefinitely, you would eventually reach a point where population will start to go down, right? Because you cannot reproduce yourself. I think China realized that and has begun to change its policy. Many of you might know that if you have there's a married couple, if one of the two, either husband or wife, or one of them is a single child, then that couple, is allowed to have two children. Okay, so eventually you will basically get to a net reproduction rate of close to 1. All right, but and this change was introduced just last year, but it would take probably 2 decades for it to have any impact on the working age population. All right, so it takes that much time. But I think there is one thing about China that would keep it afloat for the following reason. Chinese retirement ages, mandatory retirement ages, are far too low. They are 55 for women and 60 for men. And these ages, retirement ages, was set in the early 50s, when life expectancy was much lower and so forth. Today, that makes no sense, right? And if one could actually move them up by 5-10 years, delaying the retirement by 5-10 years, that would make everybody happier because they would have more. They would be able to save up more money for retirement. They'd be working. They would be the labor force will not start declining, and I think that is probably going to be what will happen. Is that the mandatory retirement will actually be pushed out. I think at the beginning, maybe optional. That is, okay, you reach 60. Do you want to retire? You want to retire? Fine. If you don't want to retire, okay, you can work to 65. All right. I think it would start that way. For younger people, I'm sure that they cannot have 60. I mean, you're not making enough money during your working life to support your retirement life. I mean, that's basically what you have to do. All right. So anyhow, so I think aging population is not a serious problem. Anti-corruption campaign. I think the anti-corruption campaign that's ongoing right now is absolutely important for China's future. Corruption is a terrible thing, and it basically sets up all the wrong incentives. People don't have to be efficient, and it's just awful. And the anti-corruption campaign has been quite successful so far. You know, I mean, the President Xi Jinping, he promised to hit both tigers and flies, and he did. He did get quite a few tigers, and it has proved to be very popular with the public. Okay, and you know, no question about the popularity. But it has had some effect on discouraging initiatives on the part of some government officials, because it is safer not to do anything. If you don't do anything, you don't attract attention to yourself, right? If you do anything, it doesn't matter what you do. If you do something, you might attract attention to yourself. So I think there's some part of the slowdown can be attributed to the inactivity of some of the government officials. Okay. Anyway, and we all know the regulations against luxury consumption, against luxury dining, which means that the restaurants in Beijing, the very top end, they have had no business for the last year or two. Anyhow, but I think that is a problem, and you know, will have to be resolved gradually. But as Wang Qishan said, inaction is still preferable to lawless action. Okay, so I think that is where it's at. I think it will continue for a while, but I think one should really focus on the fact that the anti-corruption campaign is actually aimed at the future, aimed at deterring corruption in the future. Right, it's not really aimed to punish people in the past. You punish people in the past only as a deterrent to further action in the future. So I think at some point one would have to say, let's be forward-looking and so forth. Anyway, I think the aim now is to make sure that no one would dare to be corrupt, okay, engage in corrupt activities, and hopefully in time, in a couple years, a year or so, there will be a new system in place so that it's not possible. It will be much more difficult to be corrupt. And I think if you reduce discretion on the part of government officials, that will automatically reduce corruption. Or you rely more on the market, that would also. So I think that it's still work in progress, but I think that's what's going on. Shadow banking is a serious problem. I don't know how serious this is in Korea, but in China it's becoming quite serious. There used to be 90% of the loans through bank loans, and now maybe 50%. 50% is outside the banking system. But fortunately, in China it's very, very strange, and that is the shadow banking is done. I think close to 60% of shadow banking is done by banks themselves. Okay, and it's too complicated to go into why, but basically mostly to circumvent restrictions of various types of lending and so forth. But I think the government is cognizant of the possible risk of shadow banking. It's really looking into it. So I think it wouldn't really be a serious problem. Local government debt. I think the shorthand answer is that the Chinese public debt, national debt, is around 20% of GDP. The local government debt can be estimated at about 35%, right? But you know, not all of it is going to be bad. So let's assume half or slightly more than half is bad. That means, and the central government has to assume the debt. It will be 40% of GDP. That's a very low debt ratio today. Okay, I mean Japan is at 250, U.S. is over 100, and so forth. You know, so 40% plus a very low deficit to GDP, you know, and it's really completely manageable. Chinese debt actually is similar to Japanese debt, similar to U.S. debt, is that they are almost all denominated in their own currency, right? And there's really no real risk of default because you can always print more of your own currency. Greece is in trouble because it cannot print euros, you know. So, the U.S. can print as many dollars, to repay if necessary. So I don't think there's any risk of U.S. defaulting. Similarly, Japan owes in Japanese yen or to Japanese nationals. There's not, too much risk. And I think China is the same way. So I wouldn't worry too much about the local government debt. I think it's something that actually can be handled. Deficit in human capital, this takes some time to improve. Let me show you what this is. Here I have plotted the number of school years, average number of school years per person in the labor force. And you could see here at the very top is, this is the US, this is Japan. This turquoise line is Korea. You can see Korea has really come up very high. Okay, and China is still down here, the red line. All right, so there's a long catch-up, but it's really quite remarkable that Korea has actually done well in terms of raising the quality of the labor force, and that's human capital. So China has a great deal of catch-up to do in terms of human capital. This is something else, R&D, for example. Again, the turquoise line is Korea. Korea is now spending 4% of GDP on R&D, which is very remarkable. The yellow line is Japan. Japan is around 3%, and the blue line here, this blue line is, the blue line is in the US. You can see it's still very high. China is still down here, so there's also a great deal of catching up to do. Okay, and so that's what I call the innovation gap. One other thing to look at is patents. These are patents granted in the US, various countries. The very top is blue line is the US, the yellow line is Japan. The turquoise line, okay, is Korea. You can see Korea is really catching up, going up very, very fast here, and China is down here. The picture might be slightly deceiving. This is a logarithmic scale, so going up a little bit makes a huge difference. So anyhow, so that is, I think Korea is should be congratulated for really achieving all of this. The other thing that one should look at is here is the number of internet users, and the red line is China, and the turquoise line is again Korea, I think down below. Okay, but this is a little bit deceiving because what you really ought to look at is number of internet user percent of population, and you can see here Korea is way up there. Okay, the number of people using the internet. The turquoise line is way up there, along with Japan and Taiwan and so forth, and the U.S. And China is about halfway. Okay, it's about halfway. So there's quite a bit of work to do. Income disparity. I think the income. I think it's easy. I think it's correct to say that in 1978, the income distribution in China was much more equal than it is today. But nobody wants to go back to that degree of egalitarianism with low income, all right? So today it is actually, the Gini coefficient is about 0.4. The US is about 0.41, okay? So it's, it's not so bad, relatively speaking. But of course there's a great deal of room. Sweden was actually one of the best among the Western economies. Sweden is 0.25, which is very, very low in terms of the Gini coefficient. But as I said earlier, the provision of public goods, actually, this cannot be measured, as in terms of Gini coefficient, but you provide public goods, that's a de facto redistribution in kind, which can really improve things quite a bit. Environmental degradation, China is making an effort to clean up. People are now very conscious of air quality, water quality, soil quality, and so forth. And they, in fact, I think a few days ago, they just passed a new regulation on water quality, that it has to be fit for drinking and so forth. I think in the next 5-year plan, 13 5-year plan from 2016 to 2020, the key performance indicators of government officials will include something on the environment. That is not just the GDP, not just employment, but maybe your PM 2.5. What is your score, right? So I think that will actually have a major impact on how things are done. Okay, I want to make one point, and that is China has actually become environmentally conscious at a much earlier stage compared to the US and Japan. Current Chinese per capita GDP is about 7,600. For those of you who live in the US, you know that in the 70s, Los Angeles was terrible, right? It's really absolutely terrible. But, then they made efforts to clean it up and so forth. The California has put in the catalytic converters in cars, make a big difference. But at that time, U.S. per capita GDP is at least 25,000. Okay, in today's prices. Similarly, Japan. Okay, I mean Japan. If you go to Osaka in 1980, it's also terrible, right? But they clean that up. Give them credit. But by that time, Japanese GDP per capita is also in excess of $20,000 US today. So I think it's good that China has become environmentally conscious at a much earlier stage, because the earlier you start to clean up, the easier it is, right? The longer you wait, the harder it is. So I think that's what is going to happen. Excess capacity in manufacturing, I talked about it already. I think there are two problems in dealing with this excess capacity. One is what to do about the workers. Two is what to do with the bank loans. Okay, I mean, both are really serious problems. And I believe that the right solution is probably a roll-up of some kind, that is to have some consolidation, so that these costs of both the workers and the bank loans can be taken care of in some way by internalizing it through consolidation. Okay. Just as an aside, I don't know whether Korea has Chapter 11 bankruptcy equivalent. China doesn't. So it's either going into receivership, ceasing operation, or there's no alternative. In the U.S., you can go into Chapter 11. That is, you can continue operating while you reorganize. I think it's a mistake that China does that. I've been advocating that everywhere. I don't know whether Korea has Chapter 11 or not. Do you? You have, yeah. Chapter 11 is actually very useful because it allows you to continue operating while you figure out what's best to do. The excess supply on residential real estate, there's really too much residential real estate. I think is inevitable that some developers will go under, but it's not so, it may not be such a bad thing since there's so much excess supply. Okay, we don't really have time to talk about this. Now, the new normal, can I take another 5 minutes, right? Okay. The new normal, things have really slowed down, okay? I mean, this is a chart of quarterly rates of growth, you could actually see that the rates have been coming down, but it was 7% last quarter, it was 7.3% the last quarter of last year, but I think it will stabilize at around 6.57. My belief, this is only my belief, okay, that is in the 13th 5-year plan, that the target rate for the 5 years from 2016 to 2020 will probably be somewhere around 6.5 to 7. All right, and I think it's really completely doable. But 7%, I mean, think about 7% for a minute. 7% is not a low rate. I mean, you can double your GDP in 10 years, almost double. That's not a bad rate. The other thing to think about at 7% is that since the Chinese economy has basically doubled over the last decade, more than double, 7% today in absolute terms is equivalent to 14% 10 years ago, right? So I think that's the right way to think about. Don't worry about it going down from 7% to 6.9%. I mean, that's not worth worrying about. The fact is that I think it will, the Chinese government, there are the resources, there's the capacity, and there's the will, and it will actually be okay. Inflation has come way down. The red line here is the consumer price index, and you can see that inflation is really not a problem. It cannot be a problem because and I know there's so much excess capacity, so prices cannot go up, right? If there's so much excess capacity, steel, cement, glass can do it. So, which is actually not a bad thing. So the new normal would be slower growth, I think lower employment rate. Now, I think the real challenge for the Chinese government is creation of jobs. But in that respect, the Chinese government has been doing well. In 2014, more than 13 million jobs were created. 2013, about 13 million. This year, the target is over 10 million jobs. I personally think it can be done, but it will be mostly in the service sector. The service sector is now growing much faster than the manufacturing sector, but the service sector actually requires less investment, fixed investment, less energy, and less natural resources. Okay, so that's really the way it is, and I think it is I wouldn't say it's a law, but I think it's a pattern, established pattern, that as economies grow, the service sector will grow faster. This shows you the real value added in industry, and you can see that the rate is coming down. Okay, and like I said, it's no longer the fastest growing sector in China. Fastest growing sector is the service sector. This is fixed asset investment. You can also see that that's going down. It's going down because if you expand, the service sector expansion does not require so much fixed investment. And the other thing about fixed service sector is that if you have GDP growth in service sector, 1% growth would create 30% more jobs than 1% growth in the industry sector. So everything sort of hang together reasonably well. Okay. All right. So let me just speed forward, and so I'll leave you some time to ask questions. This is what different organizations have forecast for Chinese growth in the next couple of years. You can see there's a spread, but most of them, they average out to around 7. I think somewhere between 6.5 and 7, maybe the high, just right below 7 would probably be the likely outcome for 2015. The conference board is excessively pessimistic. Okay, now longer term, I want to show you this chart. This is tangible capital per unit of labor, and you can see a big gap. That really means that Chinese workers can still benefit from more tangible capital. That is, the capital per unit labor still has such a big gap between the U.S. and China. This is my forecast about the growth rate of GDP and U.S. I'm optimistic about both, and I think U.S. will return to a growth rate somewhere between 3 and 3.5%, and Chinese growth would be somewhere between 6.5 to 7%. And at these rates, the two GDPs will cross each other around 2029, 2030. Okay, so I think that's a reasonable thing to happen. As for per capita GDP, for Chinese per capita GDP to catch up to U.S. Per capita GDP, I think we're talking about 2060. Okay, if I'm still living, I would be 116 then. So I don't know where I'll see it, but that's what it would be. You can see that even at 2030, even with the GDPs being the same, there's still a big gap. Okay, because there's about 5 to 1 difference in population. So it will take a long time. Okay, so let me stop here, and I think we have time for a few questions. Thank you.
Have a seat, please. Well, thank you very much. Who can be more comprehensive and penetrating when analyzing the Chinese economy? Okay, now Actually, he took a flight early this morning and then arrived here just about 2 hours ago. But still, he's quite alert. I thought he would be in half asleep, but anyway. So we have to let him go soon. So we'll invite a couple of questions. Okay, Dr. An and then Mr. Guan. Yes, Dr. An, and then okay.
Larry, as usual, indeed very comprehensive, insightful coverage. I have basically two questions. You did mention the issues relating to shadow banking. Now, my question is addressed to, the relationship between state-owned enterprises and the state-owned, banks. Is there any the effective mechanism to evaluate the credit worthiness between two of them? And I know that a lot of this financial distress has occurred between two of them, so I would appreciate you can update on this, especially China's privatization program in the years to come. And second, you did not mention about this, China's attitude on the ongoing mega regional blocks. For example, TPP is going to sign up provisionally by the US and Japan. And of course, China has engineered to push through the regional comprehensive economic partnership. So my question is that how Chinese view the emerging mega bloc initiated by the US and Japan. So what could be China's reaction on this? Thank you.
Okay, why don't we invite a few more? And then,
Okay.
yes.
Okay.
And then Mr. Guan, and then Professor Wang, and then Professor Kim, and then...
Thank you. My name is Mr. Kwon. I'm president of Korean Economic Research Institute. Thank you very much, Professor, for your broad and insightful lecture. Looking back Korea's history, when our per capita GDP reached somewhere around $6,000 or $7,000, when people solved the issues of the clothing, food, housing, then people ask for democracy, human rights. So you said that Chinese per capita reached already $7,600, and then still China is ruled by one party. So what about their demand or desire for more democracy? In relation with that, we have seen long demonstrations in Hong Kong, asking more autonomy. What is your expectation of Hong Kong issue? Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Wang, and then Professor Kim, and then...
Thank you very much for so good presentation. Firstly, the environmental concern. You said that China, and you seem to be quite optimistic on the Chinese environment. But the problem with China is the yellow sand problem. That's unique, not similar to other countries. So even if you start doing it right now, I think you need far more efforts for controlling the environmental problem than other countries. So I think it's a unique situation, China's unique situation, most severe problem. And secondly, the Mr. Li Keqiang, Vice Premier, said that he does not believe in Chinese statistics. He said he does not believe Chinese statistics. He relies on the use of electricity and the railroad and the use and so on. And so I'd like to know how reliable. What's the difference between Chinese method of the calculating national income accounting and the U.S. accounting, for example? Yeah, and another thing is the trade problem. We have a FTA is soon to be set, and but my main problem, the doubt is the Chinese soft budget constraint. That means that if one company make deficit, Chinese government compensate. They give money easily at the end of the year. So Chinese companies easily do the dumping activities, so that we can see those troubles with between China and the European countries. So how can those SOEs and other companies as well. Other companies are also supervised by the Chinese government. So there's a big problem. I don't know how you handle this fair FTA between Korea and China and so on. Thank you very much.
Okay. Okay. Dr. Kim last, yes.
Yes, I'm Professor Kim. And I had one comment, actually. I was struck when you said that 7% growth today is equivalent to 14% 10 years ago. So what is the logic behind it?
In absolute terms. In absolute terms.
Absolutely.
Okay, so is that because of, I mean, you seem to present a new development, a macro model, which is quite different than Keynesian's. China is a surplus economy and savings, way high, greater than the investment. And so excess capacity and the savings, this is the driving force of Chinese growth. So that's the logic behind what you say.
Okay, there's enough.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, let me go by in order. I think that the state banks are owned by the state. State enterprises are owned by the state. So if you are working in the state bank, you figure, okay, I've lent to the state enterprise. If they don't repay, or whether they repay is the same pocket, right? So I think it is actually much more attractive for people working in the state banks to say, okay, who shall I lend? Shall I lend to Sarkong, Chairman Sarkong, or should I lend to a state enterprise? He said, if I lend to a state enterprise, there's really no risk, because even if they don't repay, it's the same pocket. All right? Okay, it's sort of like lending money to yourself. All right. So I'm not saying that's right, okay, but I think that is really how people working in the state banks, how they will perceive things. I'm not defending it, but it's not the right thing to do. I think they're trying to change it. They're trying to say that a person who approved the loan would have lifetime responsibility for getting it back. So if you make a large loan and it defaulted, your future is at stake. I mean, you can guarantee that you won't be promoted. But it really is, it takes time to develop a credit culture. The problem with China, as I alluded to it, is the chronically excess demand for credit, is that lots of people borrow, private entrepreneurs. They borrow with no intent to repay if things turn sour. No, so when you actually behave like that, there's never enough money to lend. Never enough money to lend, right? And in a way, you can think of this as following, in the curb market, that's the black market, when you developers get money today, is at least 15 to 20%. Who can afford to pay those rates? Only people who don't intend to repay, right? I mean, who can afford to pay 15, 20%, right? It's like an option, right? I would do something very risky. If I make it, I'll repay you. If I don't make it, sorry, right? So you need to appropriate credit culture. I think it's a good question. It takes time to develop a credit culture. You need a few people to default, right? And for them not to, that's basically what is needed. It's very hard to develop a true credit culture, all right? And I don't disagree with you. On the TPP thing, I think what is really happening is that WTO is not really moving. Okay, the Doha round and so forth. People go round and round. It's not happening, and so people are now going to regional setups that are short of the world. All right, now, which is understandable. All right, and that's really what's happening. My personal feeling is that the really productive thing is the ASEAN free trade area plus 3, okay, plus China, Japan, and Korea. I think that would be a fantastic setup, right? And if you actually look at TPP, actually it's much more oriented, less for goods, because everybody was already in terms of trade in goods, everybody was in one form or another in WTA and in WTO and so forth. And the focus is really twofold. One is on services, okay, especially financial services. Okay, so that's one area. The other thing is that it has, at least from what I've seen, there has this provision about state-owned enterprises. All right, and I think that it is, my view is that China might be, could be interested, but I think it will actually be very difficult to comply with these, at least in the short run. So it's not going to be happening but I think TPP will probably take off. I think Japan and US are negotiating, right down to the details now. I think there's a good chance it will work and they will pass Congress, and so TPP will be launched. All right, but a Trans-Pacific partnership that doesn't really have, the largest economy on this side of the Pacific really doesn't seem to do very much. All right, so I think that's, but it remains to be seen how things play out. On democracy and human rights, I think the Chinese government, China has a different tack. You're right, it is a one-party government, but one-party government has some advantages. Namely, you have continuity of programs. You don't have to stop every 4 years or 2 years and so forth. You don't really have a lame duck like Mr. Obama. Okay, so I think there are advantages. I think what the Chinese government tries to do is to have a form of consultative democracy in which you actually can take in people's views, but without really going to one person, one vote. I mean, in some sense, there's no guarantee that one person, one vote will get you to the right place. All right. I mean, Winston Churchill said that is the best system. Because there's no alternative, but that's really not true. I think what a democracy does, one person, one vote, is really to rule out the worst outcomes. It's a min-max strategy. It definitely is not an optimal strategy. It's a min-max strategy, and it's a min-max strategy only if the people in power, that they have the culture, that they will actually relinquish power willingly, right? Sometimes it happens that the person in power doesn't want to relinquish power willingly. And you look around, I mean, there are lots of governments that the first thing, lots of leaders, the first thing they do when they get in power is to change the constitution so they can succeed themselves, right? Lots of examples like that. So I'm not so sure that at this stage that it is, a unmitigated positive. All right, put it this way. Okay, now I think the people in Hong Kong. I'm from Hong Kong. I think they were misled by the leaders because the law is very clear. The basic law is very clear. Hong Kong is not a sovereign state, right? Unlike California. California is actually sovereign, right? Right. Hong Kong is not sovereign, all right? So it will actually have to conduct business under the law. Now, all right, so if you don't like the way the basic law is, I mean, the right way to do it is to try to amend the basic law, right? There's a process. I mean, you don't just occupy central to force the government to give you what you want. And I don't think the government should or can do it. creates moral hazard. So every time you don't like something, you occupy something, and you get it, right? I think that's really the furthest opposite from the rule of law, right? You know, and in fact, I think it's also the case that the people who support the Occupy movement is in the minority. And you are basically saying that the majority should give in to the minority, which is total nonsense, right? So I don't think it will actually, they will get their way. I'm hopeful, I hope that Hong Kong will get a chance for universal suffrage, no matter how imperfect, right? It would take time to change. Anyhow. On the environmental problem, I'm not a specialist, so I can't. I can't comment on it. But I think the determination to clean up is there in China. Okay, I mean it's really pretty widespread. Okay, you know. So, and when there's a will, there is a way. There are resources. So I think something will be done. On statistics, in fact, I think the statistics of almost every country cannot be relied on. Okay, I tell you why. It's not just Premier Li Keqiang. I talked to most Chinese leaders. The consensus view is that we don't know whether the level is right. Okay, but we hope the rates of growth are right. Okay, I mean two things are different, right? Because you can have the level bias, right? And there's underground economy. In the US, I think underground economy may be about 10% or some whatever. In Italy, it's much bigger. Right? We know you can't measure everything, right? But the hope is that the rate of growth is reasonably correct. All right, that's all you can do. In fact, what is really interesting, if you're interested in statistics, if you go to look at the Chinese Statistical Yearbook, for the last 20 years, if you add up, you calculate the weighted average real rate of growth of all the provinces together is 200 basis points higher than the published national growth rate. Okay? And that is really because the Statistical Bureau decided not to revise the provincial data submitted by the provincial authorities, but they do their own private adjustment elsewhere. You know, it's really true. It's very systematic. So I think you really need to, it's not so much whether they are reliable, whether they are the best available for making whatever decisions you have to make. Okay, they are never totally reliable. I think FDA, we talked about this. And last question, I think the excess capacity is a recent phenomenon. Okay, it really began developing, I think, maybe after 2003 and so forth. You know, it's reached a proportion. And it is a problem, should have never got there. But since China is there already, you might as well benefit from the excess capacity, right? So that if there's demand, there will be supply. Okay, I mean, I think that is really the idea. It's not that it's been excess capacity from day one. There wasn't excess capacity 20 years ago. You know, excess capacity is a really very recent phenomenon developed over the last decade. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sure our audience would like to keep you all day here and entertaining all the questions about China. China is a big country, therefore there are many, many questions, more questions to ask. I think one of the bottom line of the Professor Lau's presentation, which I would like to underscore, I would like to emphasize, is the fact that the game of economic growth is game of compound interest rates. And therefore, 7% growth in China double up every 10 years. You just need to remember that. that provides a lot of opportunities for us, at the same time some challenges, so we should be ready for it. And I suppose the challenges, but I would emphasize more on the opportunity side. If we are wise enough, I think we can take advantage of it. Well, I think with this we should end this very, very fruitful session, and I'm sure we will have another opportunity to bring him back to Korea again. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.